morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This is a very different webinar that we are planning today. Right? At Profit.co, we work with hundreds of organizations across industries and geographies, leaders who are serious about strategy, execution, and impact. And one thing we consistently see is that most organizations don't struggle with ambition or intelligence. They struggle with being truly strategic in the flow of everyday work. That's why today's topic, Be More Strategic, how the best leaders think, decide, and create impact every day, is so relevant to our community. And that's why we are thrilled to have today's speaker with us. Charlie, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Charlie Curson is the author of Be More Strategic and a trusted advisor, coach, and a facilitator with over 25 years of experience working with leaders across great organizations like Visa, Unilever, McDonald's, L'Oreal, and Barclays. Charlie, we are delighted to have you with us, right? Welcome again.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks, Senthil.
Great. So, Charlie, to begin with, what motivated you to write the book, Be More Strategic? And what did you keep really seeing in real life or client organizations that made you realize that strategy was really being misunderstood?
Yeah, it was a few things, really. I'll be honest, on a personal level, it was one of those, oh, I might write a book one day, and I was kind of nudged into it by a lot of clients of mine. I think a few things, Senthil. I think a little bit of frustration, actually. I think strategy is a little bit too overly intellectual at times. It's a bit too stuck in the world of academia and at the top of organizations. And yet I often find that as a coach, it's almost left too late. So I was keen to make it more accessible and to make it a lot more practical. And the name of the book, you said it already, Be More Strategic. But there it is, right? So Be More Strategic, that is very much it. It's probably one of the most common things I hear as a coach. People come to my door privately or publicly, and they will say the phrase. They will say that they were seeking the next promotion. They were trying to get to the top level. They were going after a new job. It could have been a job interview. And these famous words are said over and over and over again. And of course, you can follow that through. I'm sure you would have your own version of it. A case in point, someone I'd worked with for a long time. And ultimately, the person who had said it to him was his CEO. And I knew the CEO. And I said, do you mind if I ask him? A little bit nervous he was. He said, no, go for it. I said, look, I'll be anonymous with it. I'll just ask him, what does that mean to him? And the CEO scratched around for an answer for about 5 minutes until eventually he said, you know what, Charlie, I would struggle to actually tell you what I mean by that. As in, what do I actually expect them to go and do and learn? So that was the crux that led me to start writing it.
Okay, that's great. And Charlie, you've worked with quite a huge number of leaders and teams, right? And the teams do great strategic planning, and they may even use OKRs for execution, right? But still, they seem to struggle with impact, right? Where does the strategic intent usually get lost?
Straight away. Yeah, I'm in a great position. I thoroughly enjoy what I do. I regularly am the person who is asked to come and design and run and the classic strategy offsite. Senthil, for large corporations, you mentioned mid-size SMEs. I have a real passion for smaller businesses. I'm also an investor, so I support founders and small businesses. And it does often get lost straight away. I'll give you a good example. You mentioned OKRs. Working in the OKR space myself for many years. Let's say your first quarterly, your first 90-day marker. I'll be honest with you, this happened to me just recently. I had to almost remind us why we're there. Why are we here? Pausing to look up and stop and think about the world around us, including with very senior leaders. I think maybe an increasing sense of pressure and targets and day-to-day operations just means I just don't think many people naturally think like that first. They will when they're nudged and encouraged, but often it's just a case of, achieving for me. I'll say something else that your listeners may find resonates. I often find actually with leadership teams, people struggle a little bit with knowing when are they which hat am I wearing? Am I wearing the hat of someone who is in the leadership team for this organization? Or am I wearing the hat of I'm the head of marketing, the head of finance, HR, procurement, R&D, etc.? And I think there is a real skill in learning to be able to know which hat you're wearing and when, if that makes sense.
Okay, great. And just moving on, before we jump into our questions, I want to tell this to the audience. We chose this topic specifically because, a lot of folks are looking at individual personal development, either in your current organization or, maybe in your next organization. And this is a truly personal development topic as well, right? Unlike our normal regular topics. And so we really encourage folks to, if you have any questions, we are going to have a Q&A session at the end, and we may even pull some questions ahead. Please do type your questions in the Q&A box or even in the chat, right? We will look into all the questions. So before we move on, Charlie, right, can you give us a little bit background about the framework that you use in the book, right, so that people are able to appreciate, your
Yeah,
responses even better? Yeah.
is it okay if I share an image? Would that help with this? Is that okay?
Sure. That'll be great.
Um,
Yeah.
so let me, yeah, I'll just so the framework is here. I'll just bring this up on screen. Just confirm for me that is visible to you. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes. It's coming along. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's all about practice, right? Being practical. You will see just looking at that before going into too much detail. You will see that it is progressive. So you're right. It's a development framework. It's progressive. I've worked with people who are executive level, right down to talent programs, graduate schemes, etc. So it is progressive. You can always be improving any aspect of that. And you'll notice that there are numbers. You've got these 4 levels, level
Mhm.
1, 2, 3, 4. I know we're going to talk a little bit about these in more detail. And if I was to be true, so the actual title of the book, the subtitle, if you like, of the book, the subtitle is 12 Essential Practices to Build the Life and Career You Want, right? And that's a really important point, which is most of my coaching work is professional, but within moments, naturally, people will start to talk about their life, right? And we'll probably come back to that subject in a moment. If I just move the slide on, you'll see how it goes down a level into the practices. And I'm sure people will start to want to sort of read those. But if you sort of see how it works, we deepen our self-awareness, and you'll notice how the practices move out from the center. In development work, leadership development work, there's this idea of what we talk about inner work and outer work. And you need to work on the inner self before you start to see the benefits of the outer work. Some of your listeners may be familiar with expressions such as what's called vertical development rather than horizontal. So if someone comes to me mid-40s and they've got a big keynote to do, they may be rather nervous or terrified of the fact they've got to stand on stage in front of 400 people, understandably. And so we could teach them to learn X or Y about presenting and gravitas and body language and all those things. But if that person had a rather troubled time, maybe at school, maybe they'd been humiliated on stage or whatever it happens to be, that's in danger of coming back to haunt them. So vertical development is the idea of working on self. It's about building capacity more than just capability. It's often about, as it says here, understanding self-beliefs. So as you work around the framework, this is the framework I use to coach and train thousands of people, you will see that then we move into open-mindedness, and then we get on to probably the classic strategy subjects of uncertainty and creativity and being future-focused. And then, of course, we're only really successful in achieving an impact, your previous question, Senthil, if we can get others on board. We need to make a decision, and then, of course, we need to be able to influence, and we need to be able to repeat this process. So I hope that helps bring that to life.
Yeah, sure, Charlie. That's quite captivating. And we will probably start going deeper, right, into each one of those 4 segments, right? To begin with, you talk about self-awareness, right? And in your experience consulting with a lot of the strategic leaders, can you give us some examples, right? Where a strategic leader has worked with, great self-awareness, right? Or maybe someone who didn't have that. And how did it really affect the strategic outcomes?
Yeah, and I appreciate even coming to this, people coming into this through a sort of OKR and strategy lens. I appreciate for some this might be sort of really, is it really about the person as much as this? Well, Yeah, in answer to your question, and I will answer both sides of that. Emotions, right? Basic neuroscience. My father was a psychiatrist. My
Mhm.
wife is a psychologist.
Okay.
Quite dangerous in my house. Um, but just understanding the basic neuroscience is helpful here. And I'm going to be very simplistic. If you imagine a brain, if I was to do a side on, sort of top of the spinal column, what you might refer to as the upstairs brain, okay, where we have longer term thinking, abstract thought, reasoning, creativity, that sort of tends to sit in the higher area of the brain. Okay, it develops through our 20s up to actually they think now about the age of 30, okay? But of course, the emotional center of the brain, the limbic system, the amygdala, there's actually two of them. They start to trigger the moment we feel any sense of fear, of course, any threat to us. So, yes, we might think about being attacked by a tiger or a shark in the ocean, but I'm sure all your listeners could think of a moment in the last couple of weeks they've sat in a meeting at work, in a pitch, in a negotiation, in a performance review with some feedback where they felt emotionally triggered. I also work outside the corporate world. I've worked with military, I've worked with Olympians, I've worked with World Cup winners. And what's interesting in those environments, that high performance environment, they train for this, right? They train the nervous system so that they can stay what you call upstairs. They can stay in their upstairs brain more often. So you can start to therefore hopefully see how that starts to play out without putting the framework back on screen, because if we can remain what we call above the line, we can stay in a creative mind more of the time, more consistently, our ability to do all those other things are far more sustainable and far more consistent. I mean, a classic one would be with emotions, would be the leader who, male or female, the leader who maybe is red profile, if you like, they're a little bit more aggressive or assertive, and they have maybe a history of doing that. They may not see it. It's a sort of shadow or a blind spot. As a facilitator, you spot it immediately. I was in a session recently where the team assembled. This is a senior team. The team assembled in a room, and I was on a flip chart. I was writing on a board. Lots of chat and laughter and internal, lovely to hear. I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at the flip chart. The door opened. Complete change of dynamic. I knew what had happened, right? I knew who had come in. They happened to then speak very briefly, so I knew it was them. And then they actually went to the restroom. And when they went to the restroom, the dynamic changed again. Then they came back. You get the idea. So I think what's interesting, the link to high performance and those high performance individuals where the consequences really matter, if I can say that, you will see over and over again, what do they practice? They practice, how do I regulate my emotions? Not suppress. How do I regulate my emotions? How do I learn to control my emotions, breathe, take my time, whatever it happens to be, in order to be able to remain upstairs, in order to be able to make better judgment, tap into my creativity, etc., etc., etc. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Right. And now maybe that provides us a great segue to the next topic, right, which is, being open-minded, right? You mentioned that as one part of your framework, right? Being open-minded and seeing beyond the obvious. So the question there is, from your experience, can you share maybe a story where deeper listening changed the strategic direction, right? And also share ideas about how, leaders can actually probably make that possible even under pressure, right? For folks who are listening. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, this may sound listening, really. I think listening is a superpower. I have worked with thousands of managers and leaders the world over. Most are terrible listeners. They really are. I think when you learn, I qualified to coach 10 years or so, and it was almost an experience of learning what listening really is and what it looks like. And that was only the very, very beginning. I've been doing something recently at MIT, actually, which is taking that on multiple levels. And you still realize how much there is to learn. But just at a kind of simple level, I was working with someone recently. He's in his 60s, he's a CEO, and we did some communication work with his leadership team. And he was quite profoundly struck by the section we did on listening. He actually went home. He's got his wife and he's got three grown-up children. And he asked them around the dinner table. He was so he was so convinced himself that he was a good listener. And you can imagine the honesty of his children, especially, who said, "Oh, Dad, you're terrible." Now, what does that look like? Well, what that looks like, maybe to your second question about what ideas or things might the listeners here have, the irony. Um, we all have barriers, right? We all have barriers to our listening. If I was to say something like mind reading, even at the moment, people will be listening probably to me and to you, Senthil, and they will be second guessing what we're about to say. You're in a meeting in the last couple of days. As a facilitator, you can see people, what they call loading the gun. People have stopped listening because they're preparing what to say, because they need to look smart, because they're concerned about judgment from their boss, whatever it happens to be. But there are loads of these. I'm sure some of your listeners have possibly been told by a client, a colleague, or even a loved one, I don't want you to listen. I don't want your advice, or I don't want your advice. I just want you to listen. Daydreaming. I did a listening audit with a team a little while ago, it was a couple of years ago. And we had a bit of fun with it. And what we did was we recorded a meeting, and then we went back, listened to the recording, and we looked for all the examples of things like where people had interrupted each other, finished other people's sentences, not answered the question. That was quite alarming. I think people suddenly had this realization that we've got a team of 10 around a table. We're not really listening to each other at all. We're kind of just going through the motions. So I think that hopefully paints a picture. If I link it back briefly to the neuroscience and the emotions, a really important bridge between the two. Think of a seesaw. If I can do a little seesaw with my hands, I learned this from a military coach. If your emotional load rises, your cognitive capacity falls, right? Your thinking range falls. A lot of people may know that. And that's why we need to work on ensuring our emotional load stays level, because it keeps our cognition higher. And there's lots of tricks around this with NLP and things like how you do this in people. But if you think about two people having a robust conversation about a strategic choice, an investment, a decision that has to be taken. Let's say it's me and you. If my emotions start to rise, I will no longer listen. And if your emotions are loaded, if you're fearful or whatever happens to be about something, if I'm able to regulate my emotions, I will be able to help you regulate yours. And that means you will be better able to listen to what I have to say and vice versa, which means we can have an effective conversation about anything.
Yeah, it's quite nuanced. Thank you very much, Charlie. And here, we actually have a question, right, from Jean Francois, right? And if you're okay, we can look at the question,
Yeah.
right? So the question is, thanks for making the time to speak with us, but curious to know, what would you recommend for someone who is stepping into the world of process facilitation, right, through OKRs, planning retreats, etc., from the world of training facilitation, right? So what would be the recommendation, right, in the theme of your book and topic of being more strategic?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. Yeah, so from the world of Jean-Francois, so you have a lot of experience in training facilitation, public speaking. I think, oh, that's a really good question. I find when I facilitate, so there is a bit of teacher course in OKRs. I often find the teach. I think it's, let's say you're running a quarterly. Let's assume we've done the sort of the initial teach, if you like. Let's say you're running the 90-day point, the end of the first quarter. I think a lot of it is about allowing that learning and that honest reflection to emerge. And I guess your role there as a facilitator is really allowing the space, the safe space for everyone to be heard and to listen to each other, so that I guess in many ways what happens is I've got this already with a client where we're not even there yet and they're already judging each other. The CEO is frustrated that they're not as far ahead. You can see people preparing their answers. That's not what OKRs are really there to do, right? It's as much a performance tool. So I think as a facilitator, you need to really have a good handle, I think, on the principles of OKRs. I think that's really important, and be true to them. I also really believe in understand the principles, but then flex to the style and the culture of the organization. I've got many clients and we all use them a little bit differently. I think that's fine. I think your job as a facilitator there is really to to hold the space while being very true to what the OKR principles and methodology are really about. I hope that helps.
Great. Thanks, Charlie. I think that's quite helpful. And thank you, Jean-Francois, for that very insightful question. Now, moving on, Charlie, one of the important things in your framework I found was ability of leaders to really handle uncertainty, right?
Mm.
And, navigating the unknown. And today, most of us are, facing that with a rapidly
Yeah.
changing, environment, right? From your experience in consulting, can you share with us an example of a leader or a team, who has handled uncertainty pretty well? Right? What did they do differently? What can we learn as individuals, from this? Yeah.
Yeah, I think in many ways, I think Senthil, uncertainty comes to the crux of the difference between strategy and planning. So if I may just go there first, if that's okay. Um, you mentioned what I ban the word strategic planning. I think you used it earlier. I tend to ban that with my clients, but that's a different subject.
Okay.
So strategy and planning, different things. A lot of people will ask me to go in and help with the strategy. What they really want is a plan, or they think they have a strategy. What they don't have, they have a plan, or maybe there is a strategy, but it's in the CEO's head, or it's in the founder's head, or it's in someone else's head. The link to uncertainty is that strategy is about choices. It's about interrelated choices, about where we play and how to win, for example. And whereas planning is more about sequencing actions and you could argue the illusion of control, go back to the neuroscience. The reason why a lot of people find planning easy and reassuring is because it's safe. Okay, go back to the neuroscience. There's a reason why doctors will quite quickly invite us, if we're patient and doctor, to create a plan, right? They're as much doing it because it lowers anxiety. Strategy is, by its nature, uncertain. By its nature, it is exposing. It is therefore uncomfortable. That makes sense. So the
Mhm.
relationship with uncertainty is one which we can train for. We can train our brains. We can practice. We can learn. We can experiment. There's a whole load of things you can do in that field. I think first and foremost, recognizing it. I also think for leaders, recognizing your relationship with control, uncertainty versus risk and uncertainty is really useful. If you're part of a leadership team, being very comfortable to know where you sit. There are various ways you can look at this, like images and spectrums of where you are in sort of that world. So again, self-awareness, being aware of that. You'll probably find in a team of 12, you may have 10 who are quite controlling and they love a plan. And then you maybe have a couple who more naturally are okay with making decisions with limited information, calling out the assumption, we need to make progress, etc. Um, I think it's in the book actually. I think I talk about this. I share a quick parable or fable, if you like. No, it is. It's a parable, and it's to do with. It goes back many years. I remember hearing this years ago, and it's to do with a group of soldiers who are lost in the mountains. Right, they're lost. I think they were lost in the Alps, and it's snowing. It's minus something. They are lost. Okay, they are lost, and they stumble across a wooden hut. They break the windows of the hut. They find a map inside the hut, and they use the map to navigate their way home and saves their lives. And it's only the following day they discover that the map is not of the Alps at all. The map is of the Pyrenees. And yet they still use the map to guide them home. Now, I'll let you think about that for a moment. What is happening there? Well, there is a degree of belief. There is a degree of progress, isn't there? It meant we made a call, we made progress, we took steps forward rather than standing arguing. And because we took some steps forward, we learned something. And because we learned something, we were able to make a new decision and we proceeded until we made our way home. And I quite like that kind of parable for how we should manage uncertainty, which in many ways links to our ability to make decisions with limited information. It's also really embracing our fears. I often start sessions by inviting people to even just privately write down what you're really scared of. I had a CEO a little while ago running a big transformation project, and he said to me, I don't really feel the team are engaged in this. I agree with it. It felt very transactional. And in the break, I made a comment to him. I said, why don't you write your fears down? It may be useful. Why don't you write what you're scared of? Because you've told me. Anyway, I didn't know he did this, right? I didn't know this. And I went away. We got to the break. We came back after the break. We carried on for a little bit. We talked about the change curve and things like that. And I said, "Hey, why don't you? Are you happy now to share what you're scared of?" I was expecting him to give one answer, and he he unveiled the flip chart, and he had written three flip charts full of what he was scared of. And I think the change in the room was, okay, we're all fearful. We don't know the answer. It's like the analogy people often have of leaders are kind of holding a lantern into a dark cave, aren't they? I will shine the light forward. I can only see so far. I don't have all the answers, but in many ways, that's a big part of what leadership is. I will guide the way. I am probably scared too, but I am aware of that, and I talk about that, and I talk about that with my teams, but I'm still able to make progress.
That's pretty insightful. Thank you. And we have a couple of questions, and maybe Vidita, you can expand on that question. But before that, let's maybe look at the other topic, right? The next topic, which is
Sure.
choices, trade-offs, and focus. Right? You write a lot about that in your book. Can you give us, maybe some idea about this particular part of your book, and also how in real life, you have seen leaders making difficult trade-offs, right? How does that work in your experience?
Yeah, well, it's going back to the definition of strategy versus planning. Of course, by its nature, you're having to get the choices out on the table in the room first in order to be able to see what it is we're choosing between. I think sometimes I find that people haven't even done that. You've jumped too quickly into planning. Um, so I think getting the choices on the table first, all the choices. What are all our options? This is where the link to creativity comes in. This is why we must get I like the idea of sort of thinking in a strategy process, you get very clear firstly on the issue. What really is the issue? I often think that gets bypassed, right? So what really is the challenge we're addressing here? Make sure a team of 12 or 24 or 50 or whatever it is, we'll probably come back to in a moment, are really aligned on the issue. And then allowing that creative space for what all our options are before we start making choices about, well, what are the trade-offs? What are we comparing, contrasting? Because we won't have all the answers, right, to the previous answer. A classic one, which is funny this, I wrote this story in the book and I've had about 6 people come to me and say, Charlie, is that about us? And it wasn't about any of them really. It was just a kind of classic business sort of school story, which is price wars. Noticing that competition are lowering their prices. Do we react? Go back to the neuroscience, lower, a reactive state rather than a creative state. Do we just react and follow them? Or do we pause, consider our options, take maybe the braver choice of thinking we'll play the long game here. We will protect our brand and our price differentiation, and it may take 3 years, but we will ride it out. So those sort of stories, I think, are quite classic ones, but they are very real ones, and they're ones that I've seen many, many times. I think also, I just think the idea of saying no to things, Senthil, is something that people do struggle with. But combining the worlds of strategy execution with sort of the performance side of things, trying to like raise the performance of a leadership team or of an organization, our ability to say no, or maybe if you'd like a little cheat, not yet, is absolute gold. So the ability to think, okay, what are the things we're definitely not going to do? I quite often do a process. You can see all the post-it notes behind me. A lot of these sort of sessions with post-its and Lego, whatever. And there's a reason for it, right? They're not gimmicks. They're useful for tools. A simple one would be this. This is a few years ago. This is just after COVID. A team, big tech company, hadn't been together really in person for a little while. So it was kind of resetting them. And we decided to do a quite simple in or out of scope process. And what I did, there was 14, 15 of them in their leadership team. And I said, look, and a lot of them didn't. What was interesting was they didn't necessarily take it that seriously, if you like, to start with. It was more like they saw it as a bit of a warm-up exercise. And I asked them just to, for the next 2 to 3 years, we drew it on a board. And I asked them all, we had the CTO, we had the COO, CEO, we had all the heads of, to write down 3 things on 3 post-it notes that, in their opinion, initiatives, projects, programs, clients, partners that were definitely in scope. And here's the hard part, 3 that are definitely not in scope. Okay. And people went, oh, that's quite hard. Some people got really busy. Some people laughed it off. And then I invited them one at a time to go up on the board and put the three that were in and the three that were out. And what was interesting was the CTO, he hadn't really taken it very seriously, and he strolled up to the front. He did his three in, and then he went with his one out. He said, laughing, "Well, I guess we would never work in the arms trade." And he slapped the post-it, the sticky on the board, and the room went completely silent. And
That's
you can
amazing.
probably guess. You can probably guess, right? The reason it went
Yeah.
quiet, he had been there about 8 months. He had gone through a year-long recruitment process. Ethically, morally, he was really against working in that industry. What did he discover? He discovered that actually they made a good slice of their revenue indirectly from the arms trade. Cue a very robust and fascinating conversation that followed. So I think if that gives you a little flavor, I guess, into maybe some of the conversations that don't happen that probably should.
I think that's truly insightful, and I think a lot of great leaders have said this, that, you really need to say no, right, often, right, and make sure that the team really stays laser focused on your top priorities. But, explicitly listing, what are the don'ts seem to be such a great idea, right? And which all of us can practice, right? Particularly
Yeah.
anybody who's leading a team. I think this is a great takeaway. So thanks for sharing that, Charlie. We have a couple of interesting questions. One from Vidita, right? We can, if you're comfortable, we can take that now. It's there in the chat, not in the Q&A, right?
Okay.
So the question is, how can we manage if trust, because you mentioned about fear, right? You had asked people to write
Yeah.
their fears, right? And I think if people are having, trust issues, right? How can we manage if trust is our fear? How can we work on our feelings, right? It's a very personal question about, people who have, trust issues and are having problem in connecting with people, right? Do you see that among leaders? How do they overcome that?
Yeah. Yes, and actually, feel free to jump. I don't know whether you're able to jump on audio, but yeah. So, how can we manage if trust is our fear? I'm not sure I fully understand the language, but how can we work on our feelings? I'll have a go at answering that, and then maybe I'll come to it. Um, I think to the earlier story, I think everyone has fears, right? Everyone does. I think that's quite normal. I ran a big 3-day offsite just the other week, big global company, and and actually this is priming, right? This is taken from high performance, we're priming people. And again, some people are like, oh, it's all, it's a bit soft and fluffy. We don't need to do this. But actually, what's interesting, you do it at the start of day one, and by day two, three, these start to come out. And of course, it's part of a leadership team starting to bond and understand each other. Everyone has their fears, right? Everyone has their fears because they may be making choices that may actually jeopardize their own role, right? This is where ego plays out. Just to the trust point, if I could go back to a classic model of high performance. Some of your listeners may be familiar with Lencioni, right? Or Lencioni, depending on how you pronounce it. The famous five dysfunctions, the
Mhm.
five dysfunctions of any team. I often put those
Yes.
five in a room and I put them just on laminates or on a Miro board or something. And I just say to a team, and people say, I've heard of that, I've heard of that. And I say, great, well, put them in order then. Put them in order of how they stack up like a house of cards. People rarely get it right. Because actually, the number one, like the layer you have to get right first before you can do layer two or three or four, five. Three, four, five are very rare. I rarely see them in practice. I've seen them in military and in some of these Olympic teams. I rarely see them in a corporation. The bottom rung, if you're not familiar with it, is a lack of trust. Number two is a fear of conflict. Okay. If I just pause on those two things in any team, it makes sense, doesn't it? It's like, well, if we don't fully trust each other, how can we really move up to the next level of performance? Well, you can sort of, but it's going to be fairly inefficient and ineffective. Maybe you start to trust each other. Fear of conflict, again, something in the corporate world is, in my experience, most leaders are really not very good at giving and receiving feedback. It's a rather sporadic event. High performance environments, it doesn't even have a name. It's just the way people operate. It is offered, it is given 24/7. So maybe that talks. I don't think it's a case of replacing or removing or maybe managing. I think it's a self-awareness point. It's recognizing what your fears are. And if you're leading a team, being really aware of, do we trust each other as much as we might, especially in a post-COVID world on Teams and online, where often people say to me they've never even met their team. So hopefully that helps talk to the question.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we have one more question. We'll come to that
Okay.
soon in the Q&A panel.
Okay.
But before that, um, in terms of really making sure that teams actually ensure that their stated priorities and strategies actually show up in daily decisions and behavior, right? How does that happen? Have your any insights there, experiences there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And again, it's a little bit like I didn't mean to sound sort of too casual about it, but when you said when does strategic intent fail? I think was the question, wasn't it? And I said, oh, immediately, right? People go back to their day job. And that's why I sort of smile because I do a lot of these offsites, but the danger is where they're done once a year. I often refer to what's called the 12-month trap. You
Mhm.
sort of we redo the strategy, we reset the strategy, but we don't really change behavior. We need to change behavior. Strategy should be indicating a change in something, which means that we all need to be changing too. We need to be changing in our skills and our roles and how our time is spent and our behaviors, right? And that's the hardest part. So I think in answer to your question, it's about how you weave it into everything you do. So if you have a Monday morning check-in or you have stand-ups or you have huddles, that it's reflected in the very question you're asking and answering, that it's in your agendas, that it's reflected in your diaries, it's reflected in the things you make sacrosanct. I sometimes work in teams where I sort of worked a lot as an advisor, but I'm also part of teams in various guises. And it's making sure that you've had a conversation about what our priorities are. It's actually why I'm a big fan of OKRs, to be honest with you, Senthil, because it ensures that we've done the hard work of what's the strategy, what are our priorities, what are the outcomes, what's the lag indicator. Now we know that, and we've had the hard, tough conversations maybe about what that is. We're now in execution, and therefore our conversations are a lot more governed, and people are comfortable to stop people going down rabbit holes. We keep the main thing the main thing. And that often when people first start embedding OKRs, what I really notice as a facilitator and coach is it does take people a good 9-12 months because it so fundamentally changes the way that they think and operate and their habits and their routines, including how their meetings run. I often find when people start using OKRs for a long time, you walk in and their meetings are really good. They are drilled. They know the difference between what's happening on a Monday and a Friday. And guess what? You go and work in high performance environments, military, Olympic teams, Michelin-starred kitchens. They have different types of meetings with different rules, different principles, different cadences. Why? Because it allows us to be more effective.
I think that's very helpful. Thanks a lot for that. Now, we have a question in the Q&A panel from Visukumar, right? It's really about cognitive bias, right? So his
Yeah.
question is, thanks for sharing the framework. How does cognitive bias impact the behaviors of individuals and leaders?
Yeah, great question. You may well know way more about this than me, but you will have noticed in the framework, up in the orange was think critically.
Mhm.
I often actually find that people mistake thinking critically for thinking strategically. I think thinking critically is a very much a subset. That's why it is where it is. So I think biases sits very much in there, understanding your biases. How does cognitive bias impact? Well, it affects all of us, doesn't it, really? I mean, it affects all of us all the time. Again, come back to self-awareness. I think being more aware ourselves, being more aware of those around us. Um, I'm a huge fan. This may be quite simplistic, but I'm a huge fan of getting assumptions out in a room. You talk about trade-offs. Um, in fact, maybe this is a nice little takeout for people. If people want to go away and how do I be more strategic, one of the things you could do immediately, go back to your team or on your own, by the way, this works on your own. Go back to your team and get everyone to get all their assumptions out on the table. Again, stickies are good for this. Everyone, we don't care whether they don't need to be the boss or whatever. Actually, the best version of this, that's irrelevant. A diverse mix of people and roles and backgrounds and ages and grades, and invite everyone to get all the assumptions. It could be about a project or an issue or an initiative or whatever it happens to be, or just generally. Give it 15, 20 minutes. I mean, honestly, you allow them to start to come. Then you start to share them, and I guarantee people will start to share assumptions that you are making in the room that people hadn't realized they were subconscious. You disagree. You've seen it as fact. So it doesn't directly answer the question about cognitive bias, but more, I think, in the spirit of helping people to be a bit more strategic, or probably more specifically, think a little bit more critically, being a little bit more objective, being more willing to both surface our assumptions as a team and to be comfortable to challenge them, which I guess takes you back to trust, right? And fear. Are you willing, Senthil, you manage a team of people. How willing are the people around you to challenge something you say in a meeting? And it's almost the invitation to the leader is finding ways, mechanics, environments for that to happen as often as possible in order to prevent cognitive bias and many other biases. I think groupthink is the classic one, or sunk cost fallacy, I think, is a bias you often see play out. It's how do you make sure any of these heuristics, because all they are really are mental shortcuts, and if we're tired and under pressure and we've got targets to hit, we go downstairs, our heuristics take over because it's human nature. And again, that's where taking your time, taking a breath, being a little bit more mindful, I think all of that helps with trying to at least surface and recognize that biases exist.
I think that's a great insight. And, it reminds me of one of the stories I heard while I was speaking to somebody in Amazon. They said that, in a meeting, a lot of times when, let's say they wanted to get opinions, they would not start with the most senior or the leader, but they would ask the junior most person, right, to start with the feedback so that they are able to talk without any having been biased about how their leaders think, right? And
That's great.
I've implemented that a few times actually.
I love that. I didn't
Sorry.
know. I didn't know that was an Amazon thing. I often say to people, you're running a meeting and you see the leader having to run again. I say, look, rather than you run it, why don't you let the most junior person in the team, or the two, or maybe pair them up actually, get two of the most junior people to pair up, because it's good experience for them. It's good practice to run a meeting. They could take turns. They could make it more interesting. They could challenge the norms, these kind of habits we get into. And therefore, for the leader can listen, the leader can observe, the listener can take their time. So still participate, but do so for a different role. So no, I didn't know that was an Amazon thing, but that's a great example.
Yeah, I think it really, the psychological safety and the culture really comes out, on these things. So great question. So folks, please keep your questions coming. Now, moving on to the next topic of scaling strategy, right? A lot of times strategy sounds great in leadership meetings, right? When you are doing the, let's say offsites and so on. But, as you start getting down further, right, at the hierarchy and, also probably over time, right, it gets a bit blurry, right? People, how, what are your thoughts? How do, leaders, best-in-class leaders address this?
Well, it's you know what of all the sort of topics, I find this one is one that we could have an entire session on. Let me try and give a couple of quick thoughts. Quick thoughts. Firstly, who's in the room to start with? Is it as diverse as it should be? Is it the same old voices? Often when I go and run a more classic consultative type project, the first thing I do is they've got a team of 12. I'll say, let's turn this team into a team of 50. Right? Let's really get some voices in the room, different voices from externally as well as internally. And I guess that is my realization of, I've worked in this field for 25 years. Okay. And my learning as I got a little bit more experience and started to run projects myself was we need more conversation. We need more insight. We need more visceral shifts in people. We need to challenge them, which is when I started to facilitate and when I started to coach. Having fun with it, strategy planning again. Strategy has a big degree of creativity in it. It's an imagined future. It has to. You can go and do scenario planning. I did a lot of scenario planning in my late 20s. There's actually quite a big degree there of being able to have the creativity to really think about the worst case scenario. You see this in the military. Some of the best scenario advocates I see in the military have rather wild minds, if I'm honest with you, Senthil. You notice that when you meet them socially. They need to have. So there is, I think, the degree of co-creation, this sort of idea of, is the group wide enough, etc. Do we have real insight or foresight, provocation? Are we tracking our assumptions? Space. I mentioned the offsite. You know what? If you are going to run an offsite or a project like this, I would invite you to spread that thing out 4 sessions over 4 weeks. Simple, right? But I've done thousands of them. You get so much benefit from simply having a space, go about your day, sidebar conversations. I chat to my partner about it. I sleep on it, of course. My subconscious does the work. I come back in the room with fresh eyes, etc. So that sort of idea. And then I think the last thing I'd say is I often think about when I first went from kind of strategy consulting coaching into more upskilling people and helping people to sort of embed strategic capability, the phrase I often got used from corporates especially would be, Charlie, can you run the strategic thinking part of our leadership program? And I sort of, this was years ago, and I started to think, well, there is thinking, okay, so let's kind of use that word. Then there is knowing how to develop a strategy, because actually, if you're in a role for 20 years, then you become the head of, well, you don't know how to do it necessarily. So that's where you can be helpful. And then here is the key: communicate it and execute it. So it's like four things, right? Thinking, development, communication, execution. And I sort of feel that not just an individual, but a team, they need to know how to do elements of all four. They don't have to be masters, but elements of like the bias question, or are we listening well? Do we have a safe environment for the thinking part? Then we need to have sort of the rigor and process of how do we do that. And then I think probably the key, but I think all of it is relevant to where does it become blurry, I think you said, is
Mhm.
because the communication isn't there. And there is a real skill to how you develop, I call it a strategic argument. Had not 300 slides. I'm talking 3 bullet points, 4 bullet points, so that leaders, and this, by the way, doesn't have to be the executive, this could be heads of function, heads of a territory, heads of a market. They have line of sight up to what maybe the corporate strategy is, and then at a functional level, they also are able to translate that narrative, that argument, into their own version of it for what it means in India or in sales or in manufacturing or in R&D. And it's not very hard necessarily. I just don't think people learn how to do it or know how to do it. But boy, when you learn the basics of how you create a strong strategic argument, those blurry lines quite quickly disappear. And then there's the thing leaders the world over love being told, which is they say to me, but Charlie, I've told them. Tell them again, tell them again, tell them again. And that's why 300 slides isn't very helpful. Whereas if it's just 3 or 4 bullet points, and it's logical and of course it makes sense, but it is rhythmical and you say it and all your other leaders say it over and over and over again. I don't sit in a meeting with someone like me arriving saying, hey, what's your strategy? And have a leader say, oh, it's written here somewhere. It's that sort of, it's in the very fabric of every meeting, every decision, everything we do. So again, sorry, long answer, but I hope that helps.
No, I think that's very practical and very helpful. And we are now moving on to probably one of the most important parts of the session today, which is, how do you make strategy a daily practice, right? What are the practical takeaways? So, in all your consulting, can you share with us, maybe some experiences where you have seen leaders, right, made some changes, or how did they really improve their effectiveness and made sure that strategy is a daily practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to sort of link back a little bit to a few things I may have mentioned. I'm just going to make a quick note to myself as well. And there's a couple of thoughts I've had on this. Um, how would you make it a daily practice? Well, just picking up on a few things I've said already, just to reinforce them, and then I'll give you something new, a very practical thing that a lot of people can do. Self-awareness, right? Be more self-aware. We've talked about that. Be present. Be present in your meetings.
Mhm.
Really listen. Really observe what's going on here. Active listening, being inclusive. Whose voice do we not have? There's a neuroscience thing here too about, a lot of strategy is about time horizons, of course. We haven't really talked about it, but there's time horizons. And there's also um, different perspectives. We need to be comfortable with, we talked about cognitive bias. We also need to be comfortable with conflicting ideas, being able to hold a paradox. So good strategic leaders are able to hold the paradox. So you need the headspace for it. You need you need to be comfortable that if you're overloaded, if your diary's too full, your head's too full, you're racing around, reacting, dealing with detailed tasks that aren't really for you to do. If you struggle to delegate, if you are a micromanager, you're going to struggle full stop. So I think some of those things are really important to allow you the space to do it in the first place. Learning to say no, of course, we've spoken about in detail. Learning to say no or not yet, being good at prioritizing, all those things, which are a little bit out of scope of this, but they're very pertinent to this. A very practical thing would be this, maybe Senthil. This might resonate. Often with teams, I sort of said this in the opening about OKRs and why I love the OKR process. And if you follow it sort of by the book, as I said, I like the principles, but it will vary depending on client. And you often have to remind people to do the bit which is, hey everyone, nice to see you again. Well, what's changed in the world? You know, what has our friend Mr. Trump changed since we last saw each other? What's happening in the world of AI? What's happening in regulation or tax or policies, or what have your customers done? You know, and most people just don't do that. So a nice way to do that would be this. If, let's say, anyone here listening has a weekly meeting, classic weekly meeting the world over, people sit there on a Monday morning or whatever it happens to be, do this. 3 in every 4, let's say, in a month. Just run them normally, but maybe, as we've said, get your younger staff to learn and run so you can listen more. But 1 in every 4, you only talk about your strategy. So if Johnny resigned 5 minutes before that meeting started, you're not allowed to talk about it. That's just discipline. We're not here to talk about that. We know that, but we're going to put that to one side. Instead, you spend 60, 90, 120 minutes as a team just talking about more strategic issues, changes, trends, forecasts, our bigger priorities. What are we actually trying to achieve over the next few years? If you do that for 3 months, by which point you would have had 3 of those, you'll be surprised how much people start to certainly understand what their strategy is or whether we have one or not. But you also have a group of people who are a lot more tuned into what it means for them practically, decisions, priorities, etc. So hopefully there is something there that people can take away.
Yeah, it's a pretty nuanced response. And hey, Charlie, I think we created a record for February 2026 for running a meeting for about 50 minutes without using the word AI. And I think you just broke the record. Okay. Now that you mentioned AI, but let's move on. There's a very interesting question there, from Kim, right, in the chat, right? How to create a strategic argument that would help encourage collaboration and partnership with external organizations, right? Any
Yeah, I'll
thoughts?
answer. Yeah, I'll answer quickly, Kim. Very happy to get in touch with me outside of today. I do this a lot with people. Um, at a headline level, sometimes in organizations, we actually need 2. We have an argument that goes externally, we have one that goes internally. It's the same as vision statements. You know, often, I hate to burst people's bubbles, but often a vision statement you see in marketing is not actually the vision of the business at all, right? It's quite confidential. Um, so I think there's a choice. What's it for? But actually, I would say the best or most successful are where you've got your strategy, probably you've got your winning aspiration, your vision, you've got your strategy, your priorities, and your plan and your initiatives. And then you create an argument, and that argument is used internally, externally, upwards, downwards, it doesn't matter. If you can get to that point, you often find that everything else starts to fall into place. But it probably is also contextual. It probably depends on context and sector and style and culture and whatever. But hopefully that helps give you a quick answer, Kim.
Sure. Charlie, that's great, and that's been pretty insightful. Um, can you take a minute now, to talk about your, much awaited program, right? You wanted to, share
Oh,
with us.
sure. Look,
I'm quite eager to hear
it's
that.
just,
Yeah.
I'll be very brief. Yeah, it's just really if anything we've spoken about today, you know, people are in a position where they're thinking, yeah, right, maybe it's for those that recognize they're maybe leaders by name or they're aspiring to be, but I think often I find people are still managing. You know, you're operating in a more firefighting, you never really get out the reeds, you're still in the detail, but you're aware that this need to be more strategic in the way we talked about today is something you would love to become and you want to accelerate. Over the next couple of months, we're starting to push basically the program. I've coached thousands of people, but we have a program that's basically based off the book. So the framework we showed earlier, myself with a few other experienced coaches from around the world will be bringing this to life with accountability, and it's all very practical. And we'll be starting it. We'll be starting it May, June. But if people were interested in just, if nothing else, is learning a little bit more about it, you're interested to learn more about the program and what we're going to be doing, then yeah, come and join us. It'll be a global program. We'll have a great cohort. There'll be fascinating people from all over the world, from lots of different sectors. It'd be great to have you there.
Sure. I think this has been a pretty fascinating session, right, Charlie? Very different from what we normally do. And, I really wanted to convey our thanks, right, on behalf of all the audience members as well as everybody here at Profit.co for really taking the time to come and share. And I absolutely encourage, the audience to go out and check the book Be More Strategic, right? I find that to be a very fascinating read and a great book for us, right, in this pretty turbulent external environment, right, about how to really develop ourselves and position ourselves, right, for the next stage in our career, right? So thanks a lot, Charlie, for coming and sharing your thoughts here. Any closing thoughts before we, wrap it up?
No, just yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Senthil. Thank you to the team for having me. I think if anything from today has resonated, those little small practices, I think strategic capability compounds. So choose something. Hopefully, there's something in what we've said today. Commit to it, experiment with it. I'm a big fan of experimenting. What's the one small thing someone could go and do tomorrow or the day after with their team? See the difference, and yeah, let me know. Connect with me on LinkedIn if you like. Let me know what you found or any other questions. If there's any other questions as well I've not come to, by all means, come back to me. Very happy to answer them.
Sure. Great. Thank you very much, Charlie. We'll see you maybe in the session in the future. Thank you. Right.
Indeed. Thank you, Senthil.